Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Melinda Smith, and I'm the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President, Research of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. It is my honor to welcome you and to engage with you, each of you, on this International Women's Day. For over a century, the international community has marked IWD by celebrating inspiring and courageous women, taking stock of the impact of concrete efforts to improve the status of women in all spheres of society, and to identify still needed changes, policies, and strategies to achieve gender equality, and particularly gender at the intersections of race, class, disabilities, sexual orientations, and other vectors of social difference. Today, 4 distinguished panelists and our elder Colin Sitting Eagle will explore with us how and why we urgently need to pursue gender justice at the intersections. As I'm speaking to you from Calgary, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piguni, the Gaini First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, SPOR, and Wesley's First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Before we begin, I'd like to start this International Women's Day with a blessing and opening remarks by Elder Colin Sitting Eagle.
Okay, kita connect sa matsuno po
Let me introduce just a minute. Elder Sitting Eagle is a language instructor at the Siksika Outreach School on 27 land and is one of the very important leaders of our treaty community. She has worked as a researcher for Blackfoot Crossing Historical Park and has been employed with Siksika Culture and Heritage Community. She has traditional knowledge and insights on the ways of being and doing that are important to our journey towards reconciliation. Elder Sitting Eagle is also a proud mother of 3 and grandmother of 8. Elder Sitting Eagle, we would be honored to have you share with us a blessing and opening remarks so that we can begin this day and event in a good way. Thank you.
Okay, kita connect sa matsuno po noxistikoi. Kita kokta betsini kokpuan isto no kanistawat ko. I greet all of you in my language. I will share what I have been taught, what I've grown up with in my 63 years here on earth. So I will start with a blessing. Ayo absuduki o ginokin na samu kinana noxistikoi o gikimatu kinan kanesukapi o gambus nokte pui kinanis takokitis wa kinana muksite puatananis. O kikimatu kinana no kamus sita pe porque sei pumapis ikinapis o gam krististum sinsakita pe puka abstutu kikimatu kinan mr puka stumu kinan o gamuk se aisti gamuk se esknematse ako kitut stapitsima nitipeta pisina o kikimatu kinanu kuswawex muksutskimanu wex akitsita menutsia o kakitiste pepuka istumuea istisin musti ka pisanos utipeta piswa itina pesti kenne kin kan stapoka man stapstuki kimatu kinan. I'm going to translate my prayer. I've been told in other presentations with not just UFC, but with other post-secondary institutes, that a lot of times when a person says a blessing in their language, you're kind of sitting there wondering, what is she talking about? Or what is he talking about? In our prayers, I've asked for protection for all of you out there that are listening to our presentation here. Also to blow away the sickness, the sadness that a lot of us experience on a day-to-day basis. I prayed for your people that you've left at home today, whether they're children, parents, or whoever is at home waiting for you to greet you when you get home. So we talk about, we ask for these blessings, that any hardships, any frustrations, we all face a lot of things in our workplace, in our home space. So I've asked for blessings to be, put upon you, that the road will be smoother in anything that you're working on, or just day-to-day life. So like I told Tracy, that I'm only here for a little bit, because I'm sad to say that we've been having funerals every day. Every week we've had deaths here in Siksika, and it's a solemn feeling. It's a sad feeling what we're experiencing here in Siksika. So I'm here with you to just kind of explain the topic of equality, the topic of gender equality from the Siksika point of view. Excuse me. So today we celebrate and pay tribute to all women, young and old, for their dedication to their families, work, and their community. This is just one day we celebrate, but every day we acknowledge those women who brought us into this world. And these are our mothers. Without them, we wouldn't be here. I am so thankful to a mother who started her motherhood as a stay-at-home mother, and to add to that, a wife of a soldier who was fighting overseas in World War II. She raised 2 young boys alone while waiting for our father to return. She was educated, and proud to say that my mother was one of 3 Siksika young women that reached grade 11 in the residential school and went off reserve to further her education in Midnapore School, Father Lacombe Catholic School in Calgary. So she had the hopes of furthering her education to hold that high school diploma in her hands, that she succeeded in her academic world outside of residential school. Being one of 3 that had hopes of gaining a high school diploma, it didn't come true, because at the time we were ruled under the hands of Indian Affairs. So Indian Affairs said, you need to go back home. You can't graduate. You can only go up to grade 11, because you need to go home and use the training and the teachings how to be a housewife. So they were sent home to do the cooking, the sewing, and other womanly chores that was expected of them. This was the start. What's that? So when you talk about a world that my mother lived in back then, she experienced the Western society living. She came back to her traditional values, upbringing. So to make a long story short, my mother raised 8 children as a stay-at-home mother. Women from Siksika back then, and in the years of my grandmother, they were highly respected. by the menfolk due to spiritual values that the women held in the sacred circle, which we still follow today. In the beginning of governmental issues, we did, equality was not seen as a norm because, again, we were ruled by the governmental hand. So we followed the Indian Act. The Section 74 of the Indian Act was imposed on us, was placed upon the table that we were to follow the Western society in having leaders, chief and council, electoral head chief and 12 tribal councillors. So that was given to us. We had to follow this under the Indian Act, which was our rule book. You had to follow the Indian Act. You had to do this or face consequences, whatever consequences that were laid on the table. And most of those included jail time, residential school. If you didn't put your kids in a residential school, you go to jail. Indian Affairs stepped in our educational system. If your kids didn't go to school, you get put in jail. So that was a scare tactic that they threw at us. So what happened was, in order to follow the Western society, it was designed that the electoral system, it was designed to eradicate the hereditary system and create something more recognizable for the Western government. In the past, there were no women that held the chief position. And this is explained by an elder that vowed to have a Sundance. Again, Sundance was taken away from us like the potlatch in BC. They were trying to strip us of all traditional or spiritual events, ceremonies that we were so accustomed to. So the word for chief in Siksika is Ninegs. Translation is men. And this is self-explanatory, that the position as chief is held by a man. The role of the women is in respect to the women in the Siksika culture as the sacred member in the tribe. Women were looked upon as a mother of the people, and the ceremony of Sundance is circled around the women, such as the women who make a vow to hold a Sundance. And also the main society was the Buffalo Women's Society, who start the circle camp, Akukatsin. In 1997, the first woman chief was elected, but the title did not change much to suit this. So she was given the title of Ninaki. When you translate that, it says man, woman, or chief woman. Today, we still hold our women high in respect, following our sacred culture. And also we are seeing more women working within holding jobs that ordinarily are held by men only, such as heavy duty operators, oil field workers, medical personnel, and more women are sitting on leadership chairs instead of chairs in the home watching their children like in the past. Elders have mentioned that times have changed, but we must instill in our young people that the role of the women in Siksika will not change in the sacred circle of our culture. And for this, the Western society, they can change some things, but they can't change everything. Residential schools provided young women to be trained as housewives, but this has changed to work in the field of men. Equality. We've reached that equality level. We've reached that gender equality by using the ethics of the Western society, but still we walk with that and follow our culture. We still have our culture that we hold strong. In honor of the women, those women that brought us into this world, namely my mother, my grandmother, all the women that have played an important role in my life. And I today am playing the same role for my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. So in honor of these women, I tell my students that as a woman, you hold your head up high. And residential tried to take that away from us. Don't live in the past. Walk with your head held high. And they can't take the Siksika out of us. And we women of Siksika will live in both worlds for the upcoming leaders we're blessed with. So when you put that all into one, when we talk about gender equality, it's kind of different in our culture because in a lot of societies, the men are like up here and the women are here, and sometimes they'll walk the same road. In our Siksika culture, we still hold a position a little higher than the men in regards to sacredness, spirituality. We're in a world where we're faced with discrimination, racism. Among our people, among our own people, we suffer that. Among the outside towns that surround our nation, we're facing racism. But when we really think about it, we've faced many things, many roads that were blocked for the women in Siksika. You can't work here. You can't run for council. You can't vote. If we looked at that and we looked at a negative point of equality, I go back to the late 60s when they opened up our bars on the other side of the tracks from where we live. We have two towns that we live across. That one day in the late 60s, they opened up these bars to the natives across the tracks. And from that day in the 60s, they didn't face equality. You know, they didn't say the men can come in, the women have to stay out. They let everybody through those doors. And from the time they walked through those doors and walked out the back doors, we started facing sickness, abuse on the women that we are supposed to hold highly respected. So that's why I say when it comes to some negatives, there is no equality. But for some other things like, addictions, it's all the same right across the board. Today, I use an example of a sad event. A young girl is being buried today. She was murdered by her common law husband. This young girl was only in her early 30s. And today, Siksika is burying a result of the addictions that are here in Siksika, of family violence, intergenerational traumas that we were faced with. When I sat there with the mother of this girl last night, one thing that really kind of sparked a thought, and realizing that today I'd be speaking to all of you about equality. she mentioned that if the table was turned and her daughter did that to her common law husband, how would we see her? How would we look at her? It's something that we can't picture in our mind if the table was turned. But then when you look at what we've been going through, and with this young girl that was supposed to be highly respected normally in our Siksika culture, she was to be honored. She was to be held high in her home. But the equality was thrown out the door, and we have to face this sad situation we're faced with today. Addictions are equal. Abuse is equal. When we talk about gender equality in the Siksika culture, we strongly stress that all women should be respected, that all men should be respected for the work they do. I'm not segregating anybody, out there that's listening to my mumbo jumbo of trying to speak to all of you about today. We're celebrating International Women's Day. Like I said in the beginning, every day should be a celebration of our mothers, our grandmothers, our sisters, our daughters, our granddaughters. I came across a post today on social media. People are holding these women that have high paying jobs. They've done so much for people, but this post was honoring her daughter, her niece, her nieces, as part of her dedication to International Women's Day. Because like I said at the end of my little talk here, those young women, those young girls are our future leaders. They will lead other young women into a world that is going to constantly change. Our world is changing, our wheel is turning, but we have to step back every now and then to go back to our traditional values. Who do we look up to? Who do we have to look up to? Two totally different things. My supervisor is a man, but in this school, there's 10 of us teaching in this school. It's equal right across the board. You go down the road to the Siksika High School, you have a man as the principal, but he is also a member of a sacred society here in Siksika, and he rules by the society hand, but always respects the women that he supervises. So we see it in small units in a school. But you go into Calgary, I've worked in the city of Calgary, and I've worked with RCMP. I've worked with the outside world. And women are not, there are people that still treat women one step below them. Example, I worked with Palliser School Division. I worked in Milo and Airwood, and I went up against the Mennonites, young Mennonite boys who have no respect for women. The women are at the bottom of the barrel in their society. And these three boys, my first day of work, they ran down the hallway. I was standing in the middle of the hallway outside of my office, and these young boys between the ages of 13 and 15 were ready to run me over. But I stood my ground. The principal was on the other side of the hallway and told them to stop. Look who they almost ran over in the hallway. And you had to see the faces on these boys, because in the Mennonite society, they're raised that the women are not equal to them. So I was faced with a culture barrier. When I worked in Calgary, I worked with a woman of another nationality. And we, you know how we gather as a staff for to have a little luncheon. She didn't come in. She stayed outside. And I was wondering, so, the curious person I am, I went out and I brought her a plate. And I told her, oh, how come you're not joining us? And she said, there's men in there. I can't eat in the same room as a man. That's my culture. I have to follow my culture. So that's an example of the Western world and your world. So sometimes we change. Sometimes we have to follow our way of life, our up. And like, I can't thank my mother enough for showing me the two worlds. And my when I teach these young ladies, these young men in our school, I always tell them the respect for a woman is gonna go on. It's you young people and your children that are going to stomp that into the ground one day. But I'm hoping that we keep this culture strong. So again, if I've been kind of jumping here and there and everywhere, I'm going to a funeral. And but I didn't want to leave you guys hanging, because I find it's important to share my story, to share our story of Siksika Nation. And for all you women that are on my screen, be proud of the mothers, of the grandmothers, and follow tradition. Keep the tradition going. Whatever nationality you come from, bring that in the forefront. Bring that in the foreground of all your lives, because somewhere along the way, there's another young woman, another young girl that is learning from you. And there's a song, they say, teach them well. And that's what we need to do. So I hope I've given you a little bit of my insight. And like I told another group I work with from UFC, if you have any questions, if there's something that you want to know more of or elaborate on, Tracy has my email. I answered 5 questions from another session that I'm doing with the Indigenous Studies at UFC. And I answered them from my heart. I didn't get a book off the shelf and say, okay, this is what my answer to this question. I answered from my experience and from my heart. So, if you want me to elaborate on something, feel free to contact me. I may not answer you on that day, but I will answer you, because I'm only giving you a glimpse of what I can share with you. But feel free to contact me. And I don't want to leave you guys, but like I said, I have to go now. So I will see you again. I will meet you again. There's no goodbye in Siksika. We don't have a word for goodbye. So
Thank you so much, Elder Sitting Eagle, for those moving and poignant and extraordinary opening. The blessing, thank you for that, for this, what to follow, and especially for your discussion about the coloniality of gender roles and norms, which you say operates across cultures, for the way it's impacted the governance relationships, for the persistence of things like addiction, the mental health and violence across cultures, and for the intergenerational trauma that persists. thank you for highlighting the intersections of gender within Siksika Nation, but also between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much for speaking to us. We want to give you tobacco as our thank you. As we are located in different places, we will ensure we get this to you right away. So thank you very, very much. And we wish you well as you attend the ceremony for the young women today. So thank you for taking time out to be with us. Thank you. Thank you. I would like now to introduce our speakers for today's session on the intersections, break the bias, the intersections of gender. Our four speakers are Dr. OmiSoore H. Dryden, who is Dalhousie, Dr. Irene Shankar, who is at Royal University, Professor Jennifer Koshan, and Professor Jonette Watson-Hamilton, both at University of Calgary. So let me introduce our first guest. Dr. OmiSoore Dryden is a Black queer femme and senior scholar. She is the James R. Johnston Chair in Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie University and co-lead of the new National Black Health Education Collaborative. Dr. Dryden engages in interdisciplinary scholarship and research that focuses on Black LGBTQI communities, blood donation systems in Canada, and anti-Black racism in healthcare, medical education, and Black health curricula, content development. Without further ado, I now hand the virtual floor over to Dr. OmiSoore Dryden and for her presentation. Dr. Dryden.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Great. So good afternoon. As I said, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Melinda Smith, for inviting me to participate. And thank you to Elder Sitting Eagle for that beautiful blessing and teaching and lessons, Modupwe and Ashe. It is a pleasure to be part of this amazing panel, and I look forward to our conversations. I currently work, live, and study in Chibuktuk, Halifax, the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. Yet we must not forget that these treaties were signed roughly 140 years before the end of slavery in this region now called Canada. Halifax was imposed upon Chibuktuk in 1749, and it was enslaved African people who were used to dig out the roads and build the city, including much of the citadel. On the southern shore of the Bedford Basin, Mi'kmaq folks shared the land with Black people, and this is what allowed Africville to be founded in the mid-1800s. And as we know, only later to be demolished by the city government in the 1960s, bulldozed to the ground in the middle of the night under the guise of public health concerns. In this acknowledgement, I honor Indigenous and Black people who continue to be here, who continue to be in relation with one another in spite of the pervasiveness of anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism, and who together fight against genocide and the afterlives of slavery. I honor Indigenous and Black people, including those who were back in the day and are in the present day, queer, gender, trans, genderqueer, and two-spirit. We stand committed to reconciliation and remain engaged in anti-colonialism and continued disruptions of anti-Black racism. In Canada, the presence of Blackness and Black people has been unimaginable and unexpected, and in that framing met with violence. In spite of the longstanding, complicated, and layered presence of Black people in this slave market-based economy, white settler colonial nation, understanding Black personhood remains ongoing work. If the presence of Black people is engaged as an epistemic dilemma and treated as difficult knowledge, impossible to validate, what of Black women, cis and trans? What of Black queer women? And how do we practice, and how do practices of medicine and science make our lives unintelligible? Anti-Black racism, including misogynoir, is a pre-existing condition through which we need to understand the realities of health for Black people in Canada. While recognizing that public health has historically been an extension of policing for Black people that has positioned us as suspicious and nefarious in our actions and movements, healthcare and public health systems continued commitments to colorblindness becomes a deliberate choice that avoids engaging with anti-Black racism and its intersections. So today I briefly explore and reflect on the guidance provided by Black feminists and queer activists and scholars. What do they teach us about transformative health interventions? Black feminist theory and Black queer theory helps us to better understand the various forms oppression takes upon our lives. We continue to work for the disruption of the single story, a woman's experience, a Black experience, a gay experience. This type of singularity also makes itself evident in science studies. The single story, the simple story, is also believed to be the objective story. Any deviation away from the simple becomes dismissed as subjective and therefore unreliable. And it becomes a big deal then that feminists challenge the objectivity of science, thus revealing that science facts are collectively created in the pursuit of normative truths. For many, they remain stuck in the belief that the subject is simple, singular point of knowledge production, even though we are complex beings with complex bodies and complex social relations. So how does Black feminist theory and Black queer theory disrupt the single story? As we know, simply stated, epidemiology is this method used to find the causes of health outcomes and diseases in populations. And in this time of syndemics, right, the overlapping and intersecting pandemics fueled by health disparities caused by poverty, stress, and structural violence, particularly during this time of white supremacy, and racist state violence against Black and Indigenous people and people of color, we need to be even more dedicated to the disruption of the single story. As we know and have seen repeatedly, there is a power built within and about how the stories of vectors of disease and carriers of disease are told, deployed, and taken up. Jafari Allen, in his article, Black Queer Diaspora at the Current Conjuncture, in the 2012 special issue of Black Queer Diaspora states of the necessity of conjunctural moments. And I quote, by conjunctural moments, I mean to index the temporal space in which the articulation of sometimes related and other times opposing or unrelated discourses reshape, reimagine, or alter our view of the present. At conjunctural moments, new ideas and practices emerge and take on added significance precisely because of this articulation, end quote. It's fantastic, really, because it suggests that we set aside the appropriateness, the presumed appropriateness or decency or properness or presentability of the single story, and instead relish and enjoy the extraordinary, improper messiness of our complex lives. Black studies is rooted in radical political and activist moments. Black studies is simultaneously theory, method, and activist practice. And Black studies helps us make sense of, Black studies is to make sense of, to document, and to engage the terms, conditions, and manifestations of Black life in Canada in its broadest possible sense. And in order to document and effect the complicated relations of Blackness, one must be in relation with the articulations, gestures, appearances, and conditions of Black folks, including Black, queer, and trans women, and Afro-Indigenous folks. So Black studies is a necessary intervention into the areas of science, medicine, medical education, and public health, and specifically important to the work of health equity. Medicine, medical practice, and health do not live outside of cultural production or this production of cultures. Its development happened and happens within the social cultural context. Black studies in medical education then and public health, therefore, includes the interrogation of the parameters of what makes someone healthy and the systems of healthcare in which we exist. As we know, the myth of a racist-free field has proven deadly. So, I recently came across this article that described a group of Black women who had walked over in the United States, who had walked over 100 miles from sunup to sundown every day in the steps of Harriet Tubman to raise awareness of Black women's health. I realized later that this article was published in March 2018, but in it, it discussed how data has consistently shown that African-American women have higher rates of illness compared to their white counterparts. And I was struck by it because only recently, 2019, 2021, have we seen articles in a Canadian context about breast and cervical cancers among Black women, and more of a reveal or highlighting, sharing information about Black experiences with birthing and Black infants. We know that there are large gaps of any in health research on Black people, on Black women, on Black queer and trans women in Canada. And these gaps of knowledge in relation to Black women is enraging, but not surprising. And I purposefully say enraging here as I'm thinking about Audre Lorde's essay, The Uses of Anger. Rage is what moves us. In their 2017 article towards a Black feminist science studies in the academic journal Catalyst, Moya Bailey and Whitney Peoples argued towards a theory that builds on social justice science with a focus on health and well-being of marginalized groups. They share a reminder of the full meaning of Fannie Lou Hamer's statement that she is sick and tired of being sick and tired. Many of us, Black women, Black queer women, Black trans women, have said this as code for we are over the relentless white supremacy, anti-Black racism, homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia. Hamer also was speaking actually to her literal sickness. According to Bailey and Peoples, during the 1964 speech in Harlem, where Hamer said she was sick and tired of being sick and tired, and I'm quoting here, Hamer told the Harlem audience about the harrowing beating she received in a Mississippi jail for her civil rights work. And she described in detail how her body was beaten head to toe. And she talked about the way that her past illnesses, including polio, made her body even more vulnerable to the beating she received in jail, end quote. And as she continued practice, and as is the continued practice, medical treatment was denied to Hamer. Her declaration that she was sick and tired was not simply a metaphor for activist fatigue. It was a declaration of literal pain, illness, and physical exhaustion. Physical and mental health remains a metric for understanding both the process and impact of oppression for Black and Indigenous women and Afro-Indigenous women, cis, trans, and queer. So Black feminist health science studies is a lens of practice that is built on existing and growing research that demands a multi-pronged approach to ameliorate the health disparities of Black women. And here I'm thinking of the work of Audre Lorde and Cancer Journals and the edited collection by Evelyn C. White, Black Women's Health Book. Of course, the work of Evelyn Hammonds, Kathy Cohen, Dorothy Roberts, whose birthday is today, by the way. And of course, the most recent text by Dr. Nicole Charles, Suspicion. Medical education and healthcare systems, similar to other colonial systems in Canada, continue to suggest that operating within a framework of objectivity, i.e. colorblind frameworks and neutral assessments, are necessary for an equitable environment. Yet these are deeply flawed and false logics, which often begin with the assumption that everyone is normally and naturally treated equally. Yet as many of us know, it is impossible to be unaffected by colonial and slavery systems of oppression. Healthcare structures in Canada are embedded in white supremacy and white supremacist logics of fairness and meritocracy that ultimately uphold the doctrines of colonialism. Anti-Black racism, misogyny, anti-Black homophobia, and transphobia are not recent phenomena that only occur between individuals or nor are they extraordinarily singular occurrences. So to understand the present, we need to remember and learn how we got here. And this means referencing colonial and slave health practices in North America that continue to inform health matrices today. In other words, to fully understand the relationship between anti-Black racism and health disparities, we must study the relationship between colonialism, slavery, medicine, and health, both in historical context and in present-day realities. This means familiarizing ourselves with Betsy Harris, Lucy Zimmerman, and Anarcha Westcott, and other enslaved Black women who were purchased by and loaned out to J. Marion Sims, the godfather of gynecology, for the explicit experimental gynecological surgeries. How does their experience them inform what we know about gynecology and Black gynecological care today? What do we know about anti-Black Satanism today when we reflect on Samuel Cartwright, who was a white Southern physician and plantation owner who in 1851 hypothesized that the cause of enslaved African people fleeing captivity was an odd affliction and peculiar mental illness, which he coined drapetomania. That to flee bondage and captivity, which was of course violently racist, and in Canada did not have good slavery, was deemed a demonstration of being mentally ill. You know, today, we still correct for race, and it's still a practice in medicine in 2022. And this practice further serves to undermine the health of Black people. So as I wrap up, let us remember that the first institute for medical education in this region we now call Canada opened in 1824, and yet slavery did not end in this region until 1834. The transatlantic slave trade and regulations of medical practices and interventions are all interconnected and exist across political borders. Let us remember and recognize that scientific racism and race biology inform these above practices, and there remains a stubborn reliance on the belief that there is empirical evidence that proves the biological authenticity of race, in which racial categories and hierarchy and a hierarchy of inferiority and superiority is substantiated. You know, we remember, or at least we should, the body of a young Clubson woman who was from what we now call South Africa, was used in the development of race biology, monogeny, and polygyny. She was colonially named Sarah Bartman. Exploring the ways that stereotypes are used to teach, learn, practice, and experience medicine is necessary, as well as interrogating how knowledge is produced within the colonial slave cultures of the societies in which we live. And this brings us to and is intimately connected with our current moment. The social determinants of health are the social and economic factors and influences which influence people's health. Social determinants of health must be woven into healthcare provision, advocacy, and activism. And this has been made even more evident in our current moment of COVID-19 epidemic and continuing police brutality. The social determinants of health are apparent in the living and working conditions that people experience every day. Anti-Black racism in healthcare encounter is an additional condition that is co-occurring, that is concomitant to the primary condition. And although patients may not be able to articulate all of the ways that racism impacts their lives, nor should they have to, health advocates need to understand that anti-Black racism is negatively impacting the health outcomes and lives of Black patients in significant and measurable ways. So in order to create health justice, the systems we encounter and work within require substantive disruption. Black women, queer and trans folks are building networks of information and support that positively impact our health and our well-being outside of normative biomedical infrastructures. We cannot do the same thing that has happened in the past and expect a different outcome today or in the future. Black feminists and queer activists and scholars have taught us that social justice activism requires a commitment to produce knowledge for intervention, disruption, transformation, and ultimately liberation. Health is a social construct necessary of interrogation because of the ways that racism, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia shape our notions of what is healthy. Reckoning with these realities is how we get to our collective desired state of health and wellness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. OmiSoore Dryden, for that discussion, brilliant journey through the pandemics, Black feminist insights into health justice, exploring the greats, Audre Lorde, Fannie Lou Hamer, but also I think the concluding with you can't keep doing things the same way and expect different outcome, and that knowledge for intervention, disruption, and ultimately liberation is what we are striving for on International Women's Day, and every day. Our second speaker is Dr. Irene Shankar, who will be speaking on why are we still fighting for change, lack of progress on issues of inequality and racism in academia. Dr. Shankar is an associate professor of sociology at Mount Royal University here in Calgary and the president-elect of the Canadian Sociological Association. Her main areas of interest are Black feminist theory, sociology of gender, critical race theory, and sociology of health and illness. Dr. Shankar uses her critical scholarship to inspire activism and change, resulting in numerous publications, research grants, and recommendations for her leadership and teaching. Without further ado, please let me welcome to the virtual stage, Dr. Shankar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Melinda Smith, for inviting me to this panel. I'm honored to be here in such good company. And as I start my talk on intersections of race and gender within academia, I'm going to take a quick moment to thank all the women whose labor has led me to this point and who have helped me get here, especially Dr. Jennifer Kelly, who I wouldn't be here without. So with that, if we could start the slideshow, that would be great. And next slide, please. I'm going to use the theoretical framework of Avery Gordon's Haunting and Reckoning to examine the ways in which the past continues to shape and configure the present, not necessarily in a cause and effect manner, but rather as attempt to understand the constellation of connections between the past and present. And so the talk is divided into two sections. The first is haunting and the second is reckoning. Both of them are Avery Gordon's concepts. Next slide, please. Post-secondary institutions carefully market themselves as spaces committed to transforming society into a better place. This is the official story of academia. This is probably the reason why most of us are here. However, this is not a space that was particularly constructed for those of us who came in later. It was, I think we all know this history, it was created for privileged, able-bodied white men, and later on marketed as a space that would allow for the upward mobility of middle-class white men. At that start, universities explicitly excluded women and racialized folks and have been founded and funded by men with clear connections to slavery. And for this, I'm thinking about Alpha Cooper and Charmaine Nelson's work regarding McGill, Dalhousie, and Dryden, which is currently known as University Acts. And more locally here, acts of violence has been supported by universities. For instance, the connection that U of A provost and head of medicine had as they were the founding members of Alberta Eugenics Board under the Sterilization Act. And of course, we know how universities have upheld colonialism through their curriculum and research. Academia is a space, as seen here in SPOR's code, that has been shaped and configured by this history, its original mandate, and people who inhabited that space, resulting in disturbances upon arrival of those who are not seen as its natural occupants, those racialized and gendered folks. Next slide, please. This history does not require our acknowledgement or buy-in, as articulated by Gordon. We're grasped and hurtled into history regardless of our desire. We don't have to acknowledge it. We don't have to understand it to be affected by it. and it's explained here as well by Dr. Smith. History's lingering effect shows up. It continues to shape our experiences and creates the conditions under which we are not accepted into these white academic spaces. Next slide, please. So how do we see these lingering effects of history? Well, we see it in our exclusionary curriculum. We see it in the way the funding is allocated. We see it in the research that is produced about us, without us most of the times. We see it in tenure and promotion decisions, and we see it in the incredible labor that is asked of gendered and racialized faculty members. In the interest of time, I won't talk about all of this, but I'm going to return to salary discrepancy and health later on in this talk. Next slide, please. What these existing relations of racism calls for is a reckoning. It's not a new call. There are decades of work calling for a reckoning in academia, some of which are, I've highlighted over here, my favorites. This call for reckoning has involved extensive labor of racialized women, particularly Black feminist scholars, who have been leading the charge in calling for systematic change. In discussing this history, Jennifer Nash in Reimagining Black Feminism states, indeed, Black feminist theory has a long history about tracking the violence that the university has inflicted on Black female academics, often by demanding Black women's labor, intellectual, political, and embodied labor, and advocating for institutional visibility and legibility. Despite the heavy cost, this persistent call for changes has not led to significant changes. Next slide, please. Instead of significant and meaningful changes, what we get to see is what Melinda Smith calls diversifying of whiteness, as seen here in the graph prepared by Academic Women's Association. The U15 university leadership continues to be dominated by white men and women. In other words, the call for diversity in leadership has translated into leadership that is more gender inclusive, embedded in somehow wishful thinking that gender equality will somehow result in racial equality, which it has not. So while more white folks who defy heteropatriarchal ideals of leadership are taking up leadership position, as Ruby Hamad in her book, White Tears, Brown Scars, says, this is not going to lead to any systematic change because they're not showing significant signs of any intention to dismantle the same inequitable system. She's saying we're not even seeing signs of an intention to change, not changes, but even sign that we have intention to change, or people have intention to change, those who assume position of leadership. What diversification of whiteness does is that it maintains the whiteness norm and ideals in leadership while appearing diverse, which is what SPOR is talking about over here. Next slide, please. Another barrier in addressing racism has been what Sarah Ahmed calls the university's adoption of non-performative responses. And I have a lot to say about this. An example of these non-performing measures is the unconscious bias training that is widely utilized by universities as a solution of structural racism, all of which has an undertone of, oops, I didn't know I was being racist. Oh, well, I'll just go to a class and get better. Along with the obvious individualization of a structural problem, the varying material effects of racism are being ignored. Despite the decades of research and labor by Black feminist scholarship in teaching and writing, somehow folks are still unconsciously being racist. It is precisely such ignorance that led Audre Lorde to ask, how come you haven't educated yourself about Black women and the difference between us when it is key to our survival? And we can say the same thing. Despite decades of research in academia that produces research, how are we not aware of what bias does, of how racism is enacted? It is willful ignorance. There's nothing unconscious about it. It is a masterful way of decentering or centering attention on white folks who somehow need gentle training to be better humans without any attention or measures to deal with what the impact of their unconscious bias has on racialized folks. While we're training white folks to be better racially, who are being racist, what's happening to the people who are being impacted by racism? And how have we created a system that allows for hordes of unconscious people running around being biased without any, in a system, like what is the system? What is the system doing? How is it facilitating this bias? None of those questions have been answered in this unconscious bias training. So not only are universities not willing to provide meaningful measures, they're increasingly capitalizing on EDI with marketing and commercializing of it through certificates. And within my own institution, there are talks about developing a minor in EDI within the School of Business. A minor being developed and the details of which I remain unclear on whether or how any racialized folks with qualification in critical race theory or racism or understanding of racism are involved in. Unfortunately, attempts to question and hold universities accountable when they provide such non-performative measures, or in Sarah's words, non-performative measures, what we get is blanking. It's almost like you haven't spoken. I actually have a lot of experiences with blanking. So we may as well be screaming in the wind as criticism of non-performative measures are seldom listened to. What all of these tells us is that these non-performative measures are not coincidence, but are implemented by design to serve what Sarah Ahmed calls strategic inefficiencies. The failure of the Speech Act to do what it says is not a failure of intent or circumstances, as Dr. Ahmed says in her book on being included, but is actually what the Speech Act is doing. As a result, naming can be a way of not bringing something into effect. So these inefficiencies are by design. Their intention is to keep us from changing or providing any meaningful address of racism that continues to exist on campus. So next slide, please. Without recognition, as pointed by Dr. Patricia Montour, and with these non-performative measures that are invoked by in institutions, what we continue to see is the ongoing prevalence of colonialist and racist curriculum. Dr. Kopnik has produced an entire book about this. We continue to see the exploitative labor of contract faculty that are disproportionately occupied by racialized, gendered, immigrant, disabled, and queer faculty members who are somehow good enough to teach, but not good enough to hire. We also have a rising tuition level, and it bears to question that with the tuition being increased, of course, the reason being that there's significant cuts to post-secondary funding, but with very little response or pushback from university institutions themselves. And at the same time, the tuitions are increasing, we're seeing greater enrollments of racialized and indigenous students, and to very little supports. And that is something we should continue to problematize. But what I really want to spend time on is, well, actually, I'll briefly talk about salary discrepancy and then I will talk about health. So salary discrepancy continues to be an issue in academia, particularly for racialized women. My own institution, Montreal University, just did salary review this past year. Well, when asked, it was based upon gender, and it did not look at racial inequality because we were told that they did not have data on race. This issue of data is something that continues to haunt me because moving on to the issue of health, and this is something that I see among my colleagues, both women who are either going on medical leave, have come back from medical leave, and the reason for this is what Jennifer Nash points out is that anti-Blackness and misogyny, including the invisible labor of Black women inside the academy, and I quote, quite literally kills Black female academics. So I know a lot of women that are on medical leave because of the racism they're encountering, the gendered violence that they're encountering in academia. But unfortunately, while we know that when I see it, I contacted Couch, Stats Canada, my own data librarian was trying to help me. We did, while we could come up with qualitative research on it, we couldn't come up with stats on how many women this is happening to, what is prevalence level. And the fact that there doesn't seem to be significant attention also speaks about the invisibility of the health implications of this. The other thing that something that we continue to see is the state interest being furthered by academia and the overtly tolerance of imperialist, colonialist, and racist discourse that the state is furthering. A current example of this is xenophobia. And while universities have been busy writing in the past couple of years about the elaborate equity statements, they have been fairly quiet on the rising anti-Asian racism, the shooting in Atlanta, the troubling violence experienced by faculty members of Southeast Asian heritage. And a particular example has been Dr. Chaobai Chen, the former president of CSA and sociology professor at Carleton, who was receiving death threats after her interview, where she refused to engage in imperialist discourse regarding China or in the demonization of China. So because she maintained a nuanced, complicated understanding of how China and the politics of China works, she's still receiving death threats. And in amongst this, and she's not the first academic and she won't be the last, but the issue is that in the rise, when Islamophobia arises, xenophobia, in all of those things, the academia tends to stay silent. When women of color who speak out against nation building, against Western imperialism are targeted with hate, academia remains silence. Next slide, please. Just because this is the way universities have been configured does not mean that this is the way it has to be. I have put a very hopeful quote up there by Dalhousie, which I look to in my moments of crisis. And it's a hopeful quote, but what I'm about to say might not sound as hopeful. So I'll leave the quote up there for you to read and be hopeful while I say unhopeful things. Patricia Montour has said that change comes from creating flux. It comes from finding ways to challenge existing power structures. And we should absolutely do that. Both Bell Hooks and Montour urge us to continue and seek changes. And I want to leave us with the same call, but with some important stipulation. One, that this work of change cannot be downloaded upon racialized and indigenous women who are literally sick and dying because of the weight of this work. Two, and that some of the stipulation may seem contradictory, but we live in a nuanced and complicated world, and complexity is where we should reside. And contradictions are part of being a complex human being. Number two, work cannot happen without us. That means that there has to be proper compensation and acknowledgement of our expertise, our research, and our understanding of what needs to happen. Number three, it cannot be done through modification of the existing structure, because essentially what we're doing is painting the walls of a crumbling building. So at some point, we need to start addressing the very structure of academia that continues to uphold the racist and exclusionary systems in place. Four, if we seek changes and if we seek changes and we don't succeed and we keep dealing with hostility, maybe we need to heed Audre Lorde's advice that the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house, and that this fact is only threatening to those women who still define master's house as their only source of support. And when we encounter those resistance, maybe we listen to Audre Lorde and go out and seek a world where we can all survive, which means that we give ourselves permission to walk away if it becomes unattainable. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shankar, for that powerful discussion on why are we still fighting for change, lack of progress on issues of inequality in academia, and for your discussion of the themes of haunting and reckoning, and the ways in which the university, which is perceived as liberal and progressive, continues to be a site of lateral and other forms of violence that reflect and that highlight the coloniality of being, but also the ways in which the intersections of gender continues to be an issue today, with the idea, especially with the invisible harms done to Black, Indigenous, and racialized women in the academy. And particularly like your closing, that this work cannot happen without us, not about us, without us, and that Audre Lorde's quote, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. And to the extent that the universities persist as institutions inherited from colonialism and shaped by rules and regulations and processes that were designed without us in mind, we will continue to produce this kind of violence. Our third speakers or presentations in this today are from two colleagues at the University of Calgary who are internationally renowned for their work on women's child equality, gender justice in Canada and beyond. And they, Dr. Jennifer Koshan and Professor Jennifer Koshan and Professor Jeanette Watson-Hamilton will be speaking to us on women's child equality at the Supreme Court of Canada, surprising losses or anticipated failures. Thank you so much. They are both professors in the Faculty of Law here at the University of Calgary. Professor Koshan's research and teaching focuses on equality, human rights, and legal responses to interpersonal violence, while Professor Watson-Hamilton's research and teaching focuses on child equality rights, property law and theory, and discourse analysis. Together, they have written over a dozen influential papers on equality rights, several of which have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. So have been foundational to shaping gender justice in Canada. They also work with the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund in developing arguments for equality rights litigation, and most recently, the work on Fraser versus Canada. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Koshan and Professor Watson-Hamilton to the virtual floor. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Dr. Smith, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to participate today. In light of the time, we want to make sure that we save some time for the Q&A. We're just going to give a really brief overview of our presentation. We happen to have published a blog post today on our faculty blog that sets out our presentation in more detail. So we'll refer to that blog post with a link so that people can see our remarks in more detail. I will just get the screen going here. Okay, great. So our focus is on women's equality rights under Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which came into effect in 1985. The Constitutional Equality Guarantee, which you see on the screen, is the result of years of hard work by women's and other equality-seeking groups. These groups knew what they wanted to see in the new Constitution in order to achieve their goals of transformative, substantive equality. Despite these efforts, however, women lost each of the first 4 cases of sex discrimination that they brought to the Supreme Court of Canada. As you can see from this slide, the first win for women on the ground of sex discrimination did not come until 2018, which was 33 years after Section 15 came into effect. That win was followed by another loss the same year, and then by a second win in the Fraser case that Dr. Smith mentioned in 2020. Women have also lost 7 out of the 8 cases they brought to the Supreme Court of Canada that focused on other grounds of women's inequality, such as age, family and marital status, and sexual orientation. So in total, there have only been 2 successful sex discrimination claims by women under the Charter's Equality Guarantee at the Supreme Court of Canada, and only 1 case that was successful on other grounds. I'm going to skip ahead now and give you this link to our blog post for further analysis of the Supreme Court of Canada's cases. The one other point I want to emphasize is that there has not yet been a case where the Supreme Court of Canada has engaged in an analysis of intersecting inequalities experienced by women. And in particular, there have been no cases to date where the court has analyzed the inequalities experienced by racialized women. There are some upcoming opportunities for the court to address those gaps. And we talk about all of that in our blog post. So in the interest of time and generating some discussion on the other excellent presentations, Professor Watson-Hamilton and I are going to stop there and open it up for questions. And I believe Dr. Smith will be moderating the Q&A.
Thank you very much. I will be moderating the Q&A, and of course, people have the opportunity to put questions in the Q&A section. And also, we should say that I think Tracy Garrett is putting the links to the blogs and other articles in the Q&A and chat, and they will be on our website after this event. So all of you have highlighted just the kind of the persistent need for, well, to pause on International Women's Day, but also the work that has yet to be done, despite all of the efforts and struggles, whether it's in health, whether it's in the universities, whether it's at the Supreme Court of Canada. And I guess one of the questions that begs is why, despite all of these, all of the brilliance, all of the labor, why does, what are the persistent obstacles to achieving gender justice? Because I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a lot. It's knowledge. It's not research. Dr. Shankar highlighted statistics. Professor Koshan and Jeanette Watson highlighted that we have the legislation, but still the interpretation doesn't happen. So what's actually necessary? We still have persistent pay gaps. So what are the persistent obstacles that have us coming back year after year over a century to keep raising the same questions? What needs to be done?
Well, I think in law, the thinking now is that the persistent problems are power and privilege. Maybe that's a bit simple, but yeah, power and privilege. A privilege to ignore, privilege to discount.
Maybe I'll just jump in there to add that most of the claims that women have won, and there've only been, you know, a handful at the Supreme Court of Canada, have been brought by relatively privileged women as well. And so some of the deepest inequalities that we see in society when it comes to things like housing and poverty, those cases aren't even getting before the courts. So that's another problem. So
I'm going to ask Dr. Shankar and OmiSoore Ray Dryden to if they have a comment with regard to health or the academy. But I guess there's also a question about the courts, which is to say, I mean, so if you had to, and I know you have worked on this, if you had to envision how this could change, and I think of Dr. Koshan's initiative here too, if you could envision how this could change at the court, what would be necessary to do that? I'm also interested in whether there's a kind of path dependencies or precedents in the court, the composition of the court in terms of who's interpreting the court, whether that plays a role. Also, same questions for universities and the healthcare system. We are asking those who are already there, who are maintaining the status quo with those with power and privilege, to actually change it, and whether that's actually possible.
Well, one of the things that would be necessary would be a recognition that equality rights are positive rights or social economic rights, and that the court has to see as part of its role committing resources, which they're very reluctant to do now. The women's wins to date have not involved government spending to any great degree. But the point about the composition of the court is an important one, and we are at a pivotal time in terms of the Supreme Court of Canada right now. Maybe, Jennifer, would you like to address that?
Yes, so there is a vacancy coming up on the Supreme Court of Canada, and a lot of legal scholars and commentators across Canada are calling for an Indigenous person to be appointed to the court, because we don't yet have any Indigenous justices at the Supreme Court of Canada. And we only have one racialized person currently serving on the court, Justice Mahmoud Jamal. And so certainly I think the composition of the court is a necessary but not sufficient step towards having a court that better appreciates women's intersecting inequalities.
Dr. Shankar, in terms of the universities and Dr. Dryden, universities' health care system.
I struggle with this question just because I'm not sure in this particular time, and I may change my mind in 6 months from now. I'm not sure if I feel that there is changes coming or there is room for changes, mostly because the will doesn't seem to be there, and diversifying, even when people of racialized folks are being put in leadership position, they tend to have to adhere to white standard to be placed there in the first place, right? So for a lot of them, like, there doesn't seem to be this critical questions of, are you committed to racial equality? Are you committed to gender equality? And what have you done in the past? It seems like just your position seems to be enough. So it's a very superficial way of assessing who is fit for leadership and who will make the change. So until I think we start thinking about things in a more nuanced way and maybe complicating our understanding of race and gender and other axes of inequality, I'm not sure we can see changes. So maybe I'm just being overly pessimistic. I don't want to be pessimistic. I really want to believe we can change, but I feel like we need to ask hard questions of each other, as well as people who are being provided the leadership positions as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, but all of the responses, and I do appreciate the pessimism. I'm not sure if it's pessimistic or realistic, but I appreciate that. So I'm the co-leader of the Black Health Education Collaborative, and I keep thinking of Miriam Taba's encouragement that hope is a discipline, right? That we need to continue to work it and work it out and all of those things. And I think as the Black Health Education Collaborative, we are wielding hope as a discipline. We're just like, oh no, we're going to go in, we're going to create these things because we need to hope that it will touch the people who will ultimately kind of be that wave of change. Yeah. But I also, I agree. Systems don't willingly want to change. That Foucault talks about this, Fanon talks about this. All of the Black feminist scholars we know and Indigenous scholars we know talk about this. So they're not interested in change. It's too hard. They don't understand. They're very prescriptive. We need to know where the change will go, and then we'll engage in that change. And I think for the work, there needs to be kind of this leap into a space where we don't know, where it is incoherent, where we're not sure how it will roll out, right? Like, this is what we see in transformative justice and mutual aid and things like that. And so I think the other piece where change happens is, when we see the Black Medical Students Association of Canada and the new Black Physicians of Canada, and like the provincial creations of Black physicians groups, and when we see those things, that those are new in the last 2 years, right? Except for Ontario, those where you have the Black Physicians of Ontario, those are new within the last 2 years. And so there's something happening there. And excuse me, I think in that space, it's about change for ourselves, right, where we're doing this work for ourselves. And this is kind of what the Black Panthers did, in their health, in their interventions in health, right? When they set up health clinics, they demanded access to all the data that had been extracted out of Black communities. And they were like, we want to analyze that data because we don't trust how you have cleaned the data and sharing it, right, to further pathologize our bodies. But we also want to work with med students and the odd Black medical professional, and I say odd because there weren't that many, to provide services for ourselves, by ourselves, and about ourselves. And I still think that's where the liberation is, or that's where the transformative health justice is, where on one hand, you're like, okay, we need to wrangle with these systems because you still need to go there for MRI, still need to go there for other kind of diagnostic pieces. But the other hand, it's like, how do we facilitate and support one another and ourselves to thrive in spite of those barriers. So, you know, I agree. There could be one leader or two leaders or things like that who are like, let's do the work, but we still have all white shortlists. We still have incoming classes with 0 or 1 Indigenous student or 1 Black student or maybe 2, right? There's still this discussion around, oh, what do we do but equity, diversity, inclusion? And do we have to address anti-racism? Like there's still those conversations. And so that's why I think, you know, we can kind of show up to help push that along. But for our own well-being, we leave and then focus on our own, like focus on ourselves to support the health and wellness of our own communities. You know what I mean? Like something like that.
I think we're gonna have to have this as a part 2. And I think we need to have you all in Banff actually, so it could actually be a space of transformation. There are a number of questions, including I see Professor Watson Hamilton answering some of them in the transcript about leave, the role of leave. There are questions about pay equity, and you know, I actually think we need to continue to sit with this pessimism, but also hope. And I think the reason I say hope is because I think hope requires, in a way, courage. And courage, as Maya Angelou says, is like a muscle you have to keep working at every day. Doesn't come easy. Because I actually think one of the things is we have been focusing on individuals or the self-help groups, because I call them self-help. I don't say the institutions are helping Black students grow or Indigenous movements or women's. There's self-help group, but the institutions themselves don't seem to be transforming. The structures and systems and processes don't seem to be transforming. They seem remarkably resistant to change. In fact, I actually feel like there's a backlash going on that we need to continue. We need to actually name. So it's not just that the all-white shortlist or the all-male panels. There is a sense in which that we are still at, it feels like 100 years backwards in some ways, and the fact that we have to continue to raise these issues. So what kind of competencies? So, and here's a question: what kind of competency does a leadership need to actually go beyond token gestures to affect change? You know, each have a minute.
Did you want us to answer that?
Of course.
What kind of competencies?
Took the power.
You know, I think a brilliant competency, and I've not seen this demonstrated anywhere, is for leaders to say, you know what, I'm not the person to do this job. So I'm going to take my million, you know, whatever my salaries are, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to insist that this job be a designated hire, not just so we could, you know, colorify the space, but also the person who comes in must have a plan that looks unlike anything else that is done before. That's what I think. That would be a good competency. You know, enough self-awareness to be like, I'm not the one to do this job, and have somebody else do it.
Dr. Shankar.
Everything that Dr. Dryden said, yes, absolutely. I want all of those things. I also want a track record. I want to see, what have you done? Like, all along, what have you done? And what have you learned from it? And what's your plan going forward? And I know this sounds very simplistic, but I want everyone to have be a critical race scholar and understand it inside out, and use Black feminist theory, because I feel like it's been laid out. The work has been laid out. I can't believe, like, it can't be more clearly stated what needs to be done. Black feminists have been saying this for years. And if you don't know that literature, then you keep repeating this, right? We keep being in this hamster wheel. And I don't want to be part of that. I think I want someone who comes in knowing that and knowing what needs to be done. That's what I would like to see.
Okay, Professor Koshan and Watson Hamilton.
I guess I have,
Closing
I
argument.
have, I have two. One is the ability to get to yes rather than getting to no, because I find that all the time arguments are thrown up for why particular kinds of change can't happen, rather than thinking about what is necessary to make change happen. And then the other thing, the other competency, I think, is the need to be able to step away from the business model that is currently governing so many institutions and its attachment to neoliberalism and individual responsibility. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we really do need to work together to achieve change, and we can't leave it up to individuals.
Last word. We can't hear you.
Oh,
yeah.
That's all very hard to follow, but I mean,
I guess you're frozen. Unfortunately, I think Professor Jeanette Watson Hamilton is frozen. I would encourage you to read the blog that's on the faculty of. Oh, go ahead.
So I'll stop there.
You were frozen for a bit, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, I see that. My last, did you hear my point about capitalism, late stage capitalism?
No.
Is just wrong.
That's a that's the final word. So and let me, I know we are just at the time, so let me take this opportunity to thank you all for being with us today. I want to offer my gratitude to Elder Colleen Sitting Eagle, to the four distinguished speakers who are in front of us. We encourage you to read their bios and the hyperlinks to their scholarship on the website, and we will be sharing those also in the release of the video to follow this event. And I do think we need to have them back for part 2. What is to be done? How do we dismantle these structures of inequity? How do we actually achieve gender? What is the manifesto for achieving gender justice at the intersection? So get ready, prepare your manifesto, because I actually think the weight of this work and the toll it's taking on us, we cannot endure it for much longer. And it's long past time for change. And if there are any people who are going to help us get there, it's our speakers today. So I'd like to personally invite you all to our next Courageous Conversation speaker series on Monday, March 21st, in recognition of the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. We will be in conversation with Dr. Ibu Patel, founder and president of Interfaith Youth Care, who will be speaking about faith matters, why engaging religious diversity should be a top priority. For more information, please contact our website at ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion. Dr. Patel will be talking about the ways, the role of the kind of the growing polarization, the intersections of race and racism and religious intolerance, and why we need to think about pluralism more seriously in the context of this polarizing world. We also appreciate your participation and willingness to be here with us today. These discussions are difficult, important, transformational, and much needed. Your willingness to be part of these discussions matter, and it is what we need to build momentum for change. I mean, I hear in the conversations today that the work has been produced, and it begs the question, who's reading it, who's engaging it, whether those who are in positions of power and influence are actually doing the difficult work necessary, whether they are listening, whether they appreciate the need, that it's not enough to have for us to have a seat at the table, but that actually the table itself needs to change. So I want to thank you for attending and for participating in Courageous Conversations. Thank you for your wisdom. Thanks to the guests who have been with us. Thank you for your openness to the participants and all. Thank you for being here with us today, and happy International Women's Day. Yes, break the bias, but also dismantle the structures of discrimination, inequality, and injustice. They're long overdue, and do so without deploying the master's tools. They won't dismantle the master's house. Thank you all for being here. Have a good rest of the day, and see you next time.